The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect the policies and the position of Now You Know.
The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. A global economic divide that the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated, according to a new report by the nonprofit organization Oxfam. The report found that while virtually everyone suffered financially in the first months of the health crisis, the world's top 1,000 billionaires were able to recoup their losses in less than a year. Meanwhile, it could take more than a decade for the world's poorest to recover. The Philippines has long had a wealth gap, even as its economy was on the rise. The pandemic has revealed it to be starker, with the country's economy shrinking 9.5% in 2020, the worst on record. The government is optimistic the economy will recover next year, but critics say that depends on whether the spread of the virus can be controlled.
Well, without a doubt, the same dynamics happening at the global level are happening at the Philippine level. I think that's the nature of unequal societies, it's the nature of income and wealth concentration. In times of crisis, the poor really do always do get poorer, the rich get richer. And I think actually there was actually a moment at the start of the pandemic that it seemed favorable that people were talking about inequalities because people realized that if people were going to be doing physical distancing, their homes are going to be different. People were getting shocked to find out that half of Metro Manila residents lived in homes smaller than two and a half, three parking spaces. People were talking about who would be losing their incomes, who would be losing their jobs from the lockdown. They're talking about access to healthcare, about who would be getting hungry, who would be able to even travel and all of that. I think all those dynamics for a moment seemed to be top of mind for people, but actually a quite disappointing thing was, well, two things. One, that moment was gone, after this wave of social media venting and expressions of frustration, people seem to lose interest in that. But secondly, the worst thing for us at IBON in particular was that despite clear validation of how extreme inequalities are in the Philippines and how the virus would affect the poor the worst, the government was not stepping in. They had a moment of cash transfers, but after that moment of actually very badly giving cash transfers, they, like social media, they lost interest and have left Filipinos to fend for themselves since the middle of last year.
Mhm. And Amitabh, it's not only apparent in the developing world, is it? I mean, we
It is
now see the great divide in the United States, to a certain extent in Europe as well.
oh, absolutely. So this is not a story which is limited to the developing countries. It is a global story, and as I just discussed about the African and Hispanic communities in the US, let me just give you one more example from Brazil. That if you are African descendant in Brazil, the chances of the person dying is 40% higher than their white counterparts. So this is a story which is across. Inequality is clearly a result of a rigged economic system, which is global in character. It is the neoliberal ethos, which is essentially pushing this inequality, where the top few ones make more and more money. It's obscene the amount of money that they're making. On the other hand, the poor continue to be poor, and in many cases, they're becoming poorer. So that's really the story that we need to address.
Can you explain to us why, even during this pandemic, the rich are getting richer? As you said, they're making so much money during this pandemic, and would you say out of this pandemic as well? And what is your basis for saying in your report, you say that it could take more than a decade for the poorest people of the world to recover from the economic impact of this pandemic.
Yes, yes. So, what is the basis of us saying this? It's not just the Oxfam report. I cited the World Bank. World Bank has come out with a new report, which is saying that it is going to be almost a decade for the poor and ordinary citizens to come back to their pre-pandemic levels. Why is this happening? I think is a complicated question, and that's what we need to understand. How there has been concentration of wealth happening at the top level. Look at the case of India. What was happening is that, and India is a case in point. You can see globally, the informal sector took a major hit. The most of the poor people and ordinary people, at least in a country like India, I don't know about Philippines, but 90 to 92% of people work in the informal sector, and it was completely shut down because of the lockdown. And given the nature of the informal sector, they do not have security of contract. They do not have social security. They do not have basic amenities, and they're not getting anything. So where was the money going? The money was getting further concentrated amongst those rich people who own those companies. There was actually no investments happening. They have actually accumulated more wealth at the expense of what could have gone to the poor. So it is, I would say, reverse of what we keep saying. We've learned these trickle down, that let's invest in growth and it will trickle down to address poverty. What we have seen during the pandemic is actually a reversal, where the wealth is actually moving up and the money is not circulating. So my sense is the global story. And until
The governments have not done enough, because we keep hearing stimulus packages, we keep hearing dole outs. In the US, it's a huge issue where paychecks are being given to citizens of the US, although there is a debate about how much they're going to give to their citizens. But a lot of these countries, Australia, countries in Europe, even the Philippines, gave their citizens dole outs during the pandemic.
So Sonny should tell us, was the dole out adequate? I can tell you the story from India. The government said we are doing a stimulus package of 10%. In effect, it was actually 1%. And then what you were doing is talking of giving incentives again to those big corporate houses. At this moment, what we needed is a direct financial support for the poor and ordinary people. And that did not happen. As in, India saw one of the worst lockdowns. And during that lockdown, I don't know, you saw those heart-wrenching pictures. You must show those pictures to your audience. People walk from Delhi and Mumbai, thousands of kilometers on foot, without any food, walking in 42 degrees centigrade, just because they had no food in the cities. They did not have a livelihood, and they did not have a place to live. And the government was actually not responding to this crisis. And it was saying, oh, we'll give incentives to the companies so that they can create livelihood. At this moment, a direct support, a direct financial support to the people who had lost their livelihood have been critical. And I think that's still needed across the world, but that's not been happening in adequate measure.
Sonny, does all that sound familiar?
Actually, it's a bit coincidental because if you're talking about the Philippine and India experience, in the whole of Asia and the Pacific, it's India and the Philippines that are competing with each other for the worst lockdowns in the world and for the weakest stimulus responses in the world. And I think we're also competing with each other to have the most unequal societies also in the Asia
It's
Pacific.
not a good competition.
I know I'm actually feeling a bit almost depressed. I know this is saying misery loves company, but like Amitabh said, we're talking about hundreds of millions of Indians in abject misery from so many things done against them. And now they're even proposing to change to limit the rural guarantee employment schemes. But there's a whole host of really awful measures in India right now. And the one thing that I think is going to make things much worse in India over the Philippines is that India's budget increase is actually going to be less than inflation. At least we're a bit more than that, but that is so crazy in the middle of the worst pandemic in decades to have countries like India, governments in countries like India and the Philippines choosing not to spend because they don't want to increase their deficits or because they want to protect their credit ratings. It's just unconscionable. It's just
But Sunny,
incredible.
the survey showed that more than 70% of Filipinos did receive dole out from the government. Isn't that good?
Uh, well, to be clear, that was better than nothing, but it was a very short dole out, and it's even much less than promised. If you remember, when the Bayanihan one was passed, the promise was that 18 million Filipinos would be getting 2 months worth of the dole outs. In three ways, they cut that down. First, not everyone got the whole 2 months. Secondly, not everyone got the promised 8,000. It got prorated depending on your regional minimum wage. And if you were receiving cash transfers under the 4 Ps cash transfer scheme, that would be taken out of your subsidy. And third, it was done so chaotically at the end of the whole Bayanihan one, hundreds of thousands of families did not get even that first one. So yes, they could say with all credibility that 80-90% of families were able to get that, but it was very, very small even if you got that. So our computation was it was equivalent of basically 9 to 10 pesos a day per beneficiary over the whole
Mm.
2 months of the extreme lockdown. So
And
that
now
was
we see
that's what we
how
talk
bad
about.
inflation is. I mean, the prices right now are just outrageously high.
No, no, actually, exactly. Hunger is worsening. And actually, it's quite surprised. There was a candid moment of the government in the reporting this morning. They admitted there were an additional 24 million hungry Filipinos because of the pandemic. I thought that was a welcome admission because that's something that they were always sort of pussyfooting around before. But the next thing you actually want to hear, if you admit that there were an additional 24 million hungry Filipinos, an additional 4.5 million poor Filipinos by very low poverty standard, an additional 2.7 million unemployed Filipinos, again understated. Next question is what are you going to do about that? At the end of it, their main recommendation was let's get more kids going to the mall. Let's keep on with the build infrastructure. And let's grit our teeth because the economic momentum we had coming to the pandemic will save the day. It doesn't make sense. There's a sort of huge disconnect between realizing how bad things are on the ground and then actually doing the work needed to alleviate suffering and to actually make recovery come much, much quicker.
Mhm. Amitabh, is it fair to conclude then that dole outs are the short term solution, but that the dole outs that the governments around the world have been giving their citizens have not been enough?
Absolutely. As in what Sonny says, there's huge resonance in India and Philippines, and as you said, rather sad resonance to have. And I would agree that the rollout has been inadequate. But once, let me just build a little further on your question. You said this is one short-term measure. I would say there are a few other short-term measures as well. And one of them would be we are talking of now a wealth tax. We are looking at a specific cess during pandemic on the super rich. And let me say that if Philippines does it or if India does it, it's not going to be the first country to do it. Already we have examples, and Argentina has already levied a tax on the super rich on for the pandemic. So these are unprecedented times, and we must take unprecedented measures. So a very strong recommendation coming from us is to also look at a special surcharge on the super rich, in addition to the wealth tax that we are looking at. And let me just say, one of the big problems is, very often when we talk of wealth tax or a special surcharge, we forget that anyways, most of the corporations in the super rich are not paying the fair share of taxes. There is a study by the Tax Justice Network which says that every year $425 billion is lost by countries because of tax dodging. So, if even these big companies, corporations, super rich individuals do a fair share of taxes, I think the situation would be better.
So it's not just an issue in the United States, because we've heard this issue over and over again in the US, where actually it was an election issue last year, where Republicans and Democrats were debating about how much to tax the rich. So it's an issue everywhere. Sonny, you want to
Can
jump
I
in?
answer
Yeah.
that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember as early as July last year, because we knew that the government was using the supposed lack of funds as an excuse not to give more cash subsidies. We actually proposed a wealth tax in the Philippines. And I think just sort of, I apologize, but sort of make it more concrete. Um, in the Philippines, it's actually much worse in India, but in the Philippines, the richest 50 Filipinos have a combined net worth of 4.1 trillion pesos. It's about 82 billion dollars. That is not taxed at all. So we had a very conservative proposal. We were figuring if there's 4.1 trillion pesos in net worth of the richest Filipinos, if you tax just 1% of wealth over 1 billion, just 2% on wealth over 2 billion, and just 3% on wealth over 3 billion, that's a net tax of less than 6%, the Philippine government can generate at least 240 billion pesos just from 50 Filipinos. And we thought that was actually quite reasonable because 4.1 trillion of 50 Filipinos is as much wealth as the poorest 60 to 70 million Filipinos combined. So even if we take out more or less 6% from their net worth, no change in their lifestyles, no change in the way they live, certainly no change in the way they behave in the economy, no less investment coming from them, but that is generating hundreds of billions of pesos. I think, in a way, easy money to put back in terms of social protection, in terms of social services. And I think that is something that has to be addressed, especially coming to an election year. If there's one thing keeping our politics so unequal, it's because our economic elites are basically behind the way elections are run. So it's also actually not just democratizing the economy. It could help in some small way democratize our politics, reducing the inequality in terms of wealth in the country.
So Amitabh, governments are not powerless to bridge this economic divide, and if they were not doing it pre-pandemic, now during this pandemic, this economic divide is so stark. Now is the time for governments to act.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. As in, if they are even uh, little sincere about what they keep talking of wanting to build an equal society, if the commitments that we have had from across the world, as in look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This was the first time that the Goal 10 actually talks of reducing inequality amongst countries, but within countries also. It was I would say, a political breakthrough to get the question of inequality within the Sustainable Development Goal framework, to which all the countries have signed on. But you don't see sincere action to follow up this commitment. And this is at least a moment when you are seeing such a difficult time, such huge challenges for the majority of the people. The government must step up and take some very, very concrete measures. So it's really good to hear such worked out plans, say, being recommended by IBON. Uh, these are the measures that the government would need to take. But let me just add a couple of more. These are short-term measures. We've talked of it, but couple of, as Oxfam, we've been talking of two other long-term measures as well, two or three. So let me just share that. One, as in globally, we have seen that the investments in education and health are big drivers for equality. And I think it's critical. As in, if you look at more equal societies, go to Norway, Sweden, Finland, what you're looking at is much greater investments in education and health. So long term, how do you ensure greater investments in education and health, which are then seen as a right for common people and citizens? That would be a critical area if we are moving towards an equal society. The second that I would say is that the need to actually start looking at living wage. We have most often, at least like in a country like India, we look at a minimum wage, which is essentially something that will keep you probably just above extreme poverty. But we need to shift that paradigm and start looking at living wage, which will give everybody a decent life. And let me just add one more, and I'll stop there. The third one that we've also been saying is, at least when we are rebooting now the economic model, post pandemic, post lockdown, I think it's very critical that we start investing in more greener and more people centered sectors. For instance, livelihood, where you, for instance, agriculture, where you can actually create much more livelihood for the common and ordinary people, and where it does not lead to concentration of wealth.
Hmm. You mentioned health and education. That's really interesting, because when I think about it, in this inequality virus that you're calling in your report isn't just about livelihoods. It's not just about jobs, people losing their jobs, people losing their income, but when you think about it, countries all over the world have been on various levels of lockdowns this whole year, and one of the most, or two of the most affected sectors are health and education. Kids not being able to go to school. How, I mean, what is the long-term impact of that?
So
Amitabh, yes, go ahead.
all right. Okay. Yeah. So it is a huge challenge. Education has been a huge challenge. Malala Fund has done a study, and it says that 20 million girls are probably not going to go back to schools. So you're going to see a significant increase in dropouts. And then, as I said, it's about girls not coming back. So there's going to be a very serious gender component to it also. And so that's one part of the story. The second, again, coming from, say, my country, a lot of people think that India is this great hub for software and IT, but the level of digital divide is such, and the middle classes, upper middle classes, are very comfortably saying that our children are doing online classes, it's working well. But let me just tell you, in India, in rural India, which, as you know, overwhelmingly has our population, uh, the computer access in rural India is only 4% for these children, and at best 15% of internet access. So all the other kids are not being able to access education. So this is a 0 year for them. And when they come back to school, they're not going to be able to cope up with the levels of education for them. Huge, huge challenge that we are seeing at the moment on education. And surprisingly, as in, understandably, that we are first looking at questions of hunger and extreme poverty. But I have not seen serious conversations happening around how do you start addressing these challenges of, say, education.
Right. I mean, because I'm just thinking, the impact of this is going to be long term, because basically, Sonny, right? They've lost a year. They've lost a year of proper education. And if you're studying in a good private school, no problem. You have good internet access and you're learning online. I mean, it's not the same as face to face classes, but you still have relatively good quality education. But if you don't have good internet connection and you are studying here in the Philippines modules that are not even of good quality, then would you say that we now have a lost generation, Sonny?
Um, uh, I think undoubtedly the poorest Filipinos, I think more than half of our students are not able to do online classes consistently. They're in modules that are dependent on a parent or an elder sibling or an aunt or uncle with enough education to guide you through that. That is not happening. So I think very easily you could say that half of our student population right now will really have lost 1 year. And I think it's so important to qualify it's not just a problem of education. These are cascading inequality problems. They're in families that are, in all likelihood, poor to begin with, in likelihood, with savings wiped out by the pandemic, in all likelihood, families where their parents have lost jobs. So you're losing your education. Chances are you're actually eating less, so you're nutritionally also backsliding. Also, chances are, as you grow older, you will have much less opportunities in terms of the social network you actually relate with and having the capital to start a business. So I think that accumulation of all these um, inequality factors coming in, I think that brings the whole problem to a much bigger layer beyond just the education. But I do agree, of course, education is it's the stark divide is really awful. But I would add, just put it also in the context of these families and these communities. They are the ones who are worst hit by the pandemic, and it's just scary to see where they will be in 3, 4, 5 years. That's also why we're so um, upset by government claims that unemployment will stabilize in a few years. We're going to get economic growth back. They don't seem to see this huge economic scarring happening. The visible scarring of informal sector earners not having any livelihoods anymore. The very visible scarring of small enterprise being closed down, and also I think the very visible scarring of a whole batch of miseducated, maleducated children. And if they don't see that, they're not going to take any measures to resolve that, and which unfortunately they are not doing it now. So my last point there is all of this is avoidable. It's of course difficult, but it starts with the government realizing they are the only entity in the Philippines with enough resources, authority, capacity, organization to address all these. And if they choose not to for some absurd reason, they're abdicating their basic responsibility to help the Filipino people.
I mean, is there anything that we as a society can do, Amitabh? I mean, of course, we want our governments to act. That's a given. But we as a society, as a whole, is there anything that we can do to help bridge this divide?
So, Bans, I would say let's start by recognizing that billionaires are not a sign of economic success. They're actually a sign of economic failure. And we've got our gaze completely wrong. It is not the increasing wealth of the billionaires that should be on our gaze. It is really the well being of the majority of the population. Their access to education and health, access to nutrition, those are questions that we must really look at. So, how do we, let's reboot our world very differently. Can we learn from, say, though a small country, but a neighboring country of mine, Bhutan, which says we're not interested in looking at the GDP, but we look at the gross happiness index. I think
Mm-hmm.
these are the ways I think we need to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Sonny, you and I were just talking about that off camera, off the air, how economists and especially those who work in government only look at the numbers. That's a is that Amitabh is basically
Yeah.
saying that's the wrong way to look at things.
Of course, that was a simplistic way of putting it, but I think the basic problem is if you have ideological blinders in your economic and development policy, if you're thinking that there is some kind of magic to the free market and the invisible hand, and worst of all, if you believe that economies and society should be organized to be competitive and people fighting over each other to get the most wealth, to be the most successful, I completely give Amitabh. That kind of society is what we have now. We are not seeing any fundamental social progress over decades. Actually, it's gotten worse, I think, in the last 3, 4 decades of neoliberalism. When you've had governments rolling back on their responsibility to protect wages, to protect workers' rights, to provide social protection, to provide efficient public services, to provide good social protection, and the whole range of social, economic, and cultural rights. That was the big casualty of 4 decades of fetishizing the market to give development. And to go back to our economic managers right now, I actually keenly follow India's economic managers as well because I don't want to sound facetious. It is misery loves company. The fact that India is so big but you have such hugely neoliberal economic managers, but at the same time, a huge spontaneous sentiment against them and organized farmers, like just last year, organizing on against the laws. It's actually heartening to see that you can have that kind of retrogressive, reactionary government at the same time as people pushing for that change. And again, to be candid, the reason I like looking at India so much, not just because we're similar in so many ways, but India is so huge, any major change in terms of socio-economic policy in India will have repercussions in the rest of the developing world. So quite
Sonny,
excited to see what will happen in
Sonny
the
is
coming
pretty
years.
knowledgeable about India, Amitabh. What did you say?
Sorry, Burns, can you repeat the question?
No. It's not a question. I was just saying that Sonny sounds pretty knowledgeable about what's going on in India. Wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question, both of you. I mean, this is something that we've been discussing for a long time before the pandemic, but now this growing income inequality has come to the fore because of the pandemic itself. It's really shown itself, this stark economic divide all around the world. So, I mean, wouldn't you say that this is something that's good that's come out of this crisis?
It was a devastating crisis. To actually find something good in it is going to be difficult. But let me once just say one thing. I would say that yes, the inequality question has got highlighted at this moment because of the pandemic. But as Sonny was saying, I would say that in the last few years, where you have seen the gulf between the rich and poor become bigger, what you're also seeing is citizens' actions, social protest across the world. Last year, we saw movements happening from Latin America to Beirut to India, which are essentially citizens coming out on the streets and saying that these levels of obscene inequality are not all right. We would have to invest in a more redistributive framework if we're going to look at a more just future.
Sonny, final word.
Last word, I think it is good there's more attention to inequality. But right now, I think our common problem around the world is that even if the people know there's inequality, even if they have a concrete program for resolving that, the political forces are really arrayed quite strongly against them, whether it's cracking down on so called communists in India or in the Philippines. Actually, these are, I think, the main barriers to overcoming inequality in the Philippines and in India and in the rest of the world. It's not people not knowing the problem. Everyone knows the problem. It's not there not being a solution. There are clear solutions. It's because there are political barriers by those in power. And I think the most important thing is every step of the way in every possible realm. It could be elections. It could be pouring out in the streets in the hundreds of millions, as was done in India, as happens in the Philippines. In every possible way, let's make the economically rational thing the politically inevitable thing. And I think that's something really have to work so much harder for, especially with this rise of authoritarianism, populism, and really awful and oppressive governments.
All right, a lot of things to digest there, but we're gonna have to leave it at that. That's all the time that we have tonight. Thank you so much, Amitabh Behar, the CEO of Oxfam in India. Thank you for joining us all the way from New Delhi. Thank you, Sonny Africa, Executive Director of the Philippine think tank IBON Foundation. Thank you both for your valuable insights on this very, very important issue of our time. My name is Barnaby Lo. Again, this is Viewpoint. You can watch us live every Saturday at 6 in the evening, Philippine time. And do join us again next week here on Now You Know.